Hello everyone, hope that you all are doing well. Whenever you have made your first project connecting your Spring Boot app, we can actually run two databases on a single application at a particular time, right? So I have already covered few videos on MySQL database connection, Postgres database connection, H2 database connection, and also I have made a video, the previous video, which covers how you can switch between different databases, right? So it was basically that your code will remain intact, just that your property configurations would change and you can switch between different databases. So in today's video, we'll discuss that you can use two databases at a time in your application, right? So just before jumping into the video, I would like to request you that if you find my videos knowledgeable, do hit like, share and comment on the video. If new to the channel, please subscribe and hit the bell icon. So what could be an advantage of using two or maybe three databases in a single Spring Boot application? So it provides you flexibility in terms of how you can manage your data. You can actually choose different databases for different purposes. Or maybe you can choose one database as your inventory database and one can be a consumer centric database, which is taking the data every day and then putting that data into the backend database that you are using as a secondary database and clearing its tables, right? So the space could be managed for your primary database. So that could be one of the applications of using two databases at a particular time. So now I'll jump on to how to implement two databases in a single application, right? So let me first take you to a flow graph which explains that when we have a single database in your application, then what is the flow of Spring Boot? How Spring Boot configures everything for you, right? So when there is a single database that you can see on your screen, when there is a single database, the data source, the entity manager, the transaction manager, which if you want to perform any operation with the database, these all are required. Data source has been required. Entity manager has been required to manage your entities. Then transaction manager is required to perform the transaction as in to save your data, to insert your data, to actually fetch your data. So all those are called as transactions, right? So all those things like data source, entity manager, transaction manager are being managed by Spring Boot, right? So Spring Boot has a default property of a data source configuration, which is enabled when you use a single database in your property files, right? When you configure your database properties in a property file, it reads your dialect of your database, then your driver of the database, and then sees the pom.xml, checks that the dependency of what database you have entered, and then it configures that database for you when you are using a single database. Now the question comes that when we use two different databases, can Spring configure it by itself? The answer is no. Spring gets confused, right? Let me switch to another flow graph. So Spring actually gets confused that which database to pick, right? So for that, you have to define your own data source, entity manager and transaction managers, right? You can see here that I've used database 1, database 2, and for those we have defined data source 1, entity manager 1, transaction manager 1. Then we have data source 2, entity manager 2 and transaction manager 2. And you can also see that when two or more database present, Spring gets confused which database to pick. That is why you have to define different data source, entity manager, transaction manager for all the database that you are using in your application. So now I guess it is clear that when we are using two databases, we have to do some configuration by ourselves. We can't rely on Spring for everything. So now as we have understood the theory part, that how we have to take care of our data source, entity manager and transaction manager when we are using two different databases. So now let's jump to the code part, right? Let me take you to the IDE and let me discuss the code part first. So this is my project and package structure looks like. This is how my package structure looks like. So here you will notice one thing, that we have two different packages of entity, right? One is for entity 1 and then is for entity 2. And then we have also two different packages for repository. One is repo 1 and one is repo 2. So if I take you to the entity 1, so it contains a student class and a student DTO. So student class is a simple student class marked as a student, and we have the ID, name, standard and school name, and some getters and setters for it. And then we have the DTO class. DTO is again a data transfer object used to get data from the APIs, and then we are converting that data into an entity object, and then we are persisting that data. So we have this DTO object for us. And then if we go to the entity 2 structure, we have the teacher object, right? We have the teacher entity, which has ID, name and subject, right? And then we also have a teacher DTO, right? So name and subject are there in the teacher DTO. So this is my entity structure. Then for the two entities, that is student and teacher, we need different repositories. So the repo 1 contains the student repository, and the repo 2 contains the teacher repository. So student repository is a simple repository marked as @repository and extended by JPA repository, right? So JPA repository, we are using the default method provided by JPA repository here, right? And then we have our another repository class, that is our teacher repository, right? So teacher repository is also same. JPA repository has been extended with it also, right? So now we are done with the model part, the entity part and the repository part. Now comes the configuration part, right? Let us discuss the configuration part. Now in the configuration package also, you can see that I have two different files naming database config.java and database config1.java. So here also we are defining configuration in different files, right? So if I go to database config.java, so you can see here that how we are defining here. We are actually marking this class as @configuration because it contains our configuration of the application. Then we have the enable transaction manager annotation, and then we have the enable JPA repository annotation. So enable JPA repository, right? We have defined few things in the @enable JPA repository annotation, that is the entity manager reference, base package and transaction manager reference. So the base package, you can see that we have defined the base package of repo 1, right? So by this also you can identify that this configuration is for student repository, right? So the data that will be persisted by this configuration would be of student, right? So here we have the base package as a student repository, right? We have given the package name. Then we need the entity manager reference name and the transaction manager reference name. I'll cover that when we discuss the below code. Then we have an annotation of auto-wired, and we have the environment object. So we have taken this environment object because we need to pick the properties from application.properties files and put it in these methods, right? To tell the code that, okay, these are the properties whose values you have to pick, right? So here we are defining a data source object, right? We are making a bean of data source object. Now you can see that I have defined a name of data source as student data source. So you can give a very custom name also, right? Just that you have to avoid between the two configurations, you have to avoid the same naming convention. So you have to be different in both the naming conventions, right? So here I am defining a primary bean of data source, and then we have our driver manager data source object in which I am actually setting the URL, username, password and driver, and picking those values from the application.property file, right? So if I show you that student.datasource URL, if I go to application.property file, let me first tell you that what we are doing in application.property file. So here you can see that something is different, right? We used to use spring.datasource.url, but here we are using student.datasource.url, right? Student.datasource.url username. First we used the spring.datasource.username, right? So why are we using this? Just to make it a custom, right? So we want to use two different databases, so Spring doesn't get confused, and here also it doesn't mark the duplicate entry of the property. That's why we are using a custom property, right? So we have marked that student.datasource.url, student.datasource.username, and then password, and then the driver class. And for the teacher, we are using teacher.datasource.url, datasource.username, password, and driver class. So I am persisting the data of student in Postgres database, and we are persisting the teacher data in the MySQL database, right? So I'll make the databases in front of you in the video only. So this is my all the properties that I've put in application.properties, right? So if we come back to the configuration, what are we saying? That okay, make my data source object which will have these values already set. So it will say that okay, ds.set URL env.get property from student.datasource.url. So it will say that okay, the URL that you have to set is of this, right? So it is of JDBC Postgres localhost 5432 student, right? So this is the URL that you have to set in this database configuration. Same is the case for password, same is the case for the driver class, right? Now we have defined our data source object and we are returning our data source object from here, right? So now, as I said, that three things we have to do: data source and then entity manager, then transaction manager. And all those things would be injected into each other, right? So the data source will be injected into entity manager will be injected into transaction manager. So if we come back to the code, now we have defined the bean for entity manager. Here also I have given a name, a very custom name of student entity manager factory, right? Here we have defined an object of local container entity manager factory bean, and then we have bean.set data source, right? So we have said that okay, set this data source and call this method for setting the data source object. So this is my data source object set into the entity manager object, right? Then we have the JPA vendor object that we will be setting in the bean, and then we have a hash map, right? So we have defined a hash map to take some few default properties that we need, right? So there are few default properties that are required, that is HBM to DDL, that will define okay, if the tables are not present, create the table. If the table is present, then update the table, right? And then we have a dialect value, right? So if I'm using the Postgres database for student entity, so here I have defined the dialect value as a Postgres dialect, right? And then we have the JPA property map. We have actually set the bean with the JPA property map. Then you can see one thing is that bean.set package to scan, right? When we used to run on a simple project on Java, we used to define that package to scan, we have to put the entity package there, right? So when the project will run, it has to compile those entities. So same is the case. We have said that bean.set package to scan com.db.implementation.entity1. So com.db.implementation.entity1 is the package for student, right? So it will take this package and compile the classes, right? And it will return the bean. So now here we are returning the bean and it will return my student entity manager factory. So now this student entity manager factory needs to be injected into transaction manager object. So here we have defined a transaction manager bean with the name of student transaction manager. And here we have the entity manager object. And we are saying that @qualifier, the name is student entity manager. So @qualifier actually tells you that if there are two duplicate things, then @qualifier actually points to that which you are referring to, right? So if I am defining an entity manager object, entity manager factory object, then it could be a entity manager by default object as well, right? But I am saying that I have already made an object of entity manager factory, that is student entity manager. So pick that object for this, right? And then we are returning the JPA transaction manager. So this is how you have to define the configurations for your particular database, right? So here I have defined the data source, then this data source has been injected into the entity manager, then this entity manager has been injected into the transaction manager, right? So this is how you define the configuration, and same is the case for another entity, right? We are using the second entity of teacher. So let me take you to a second configuration file. So now you can see here that here the repository package is being changed. It is taking repo2. So repo2 contains a teacher repository, right? So same, we have defined the configurations. We have picked it from the application.property file. Just that the names are different. Teacher data source is there. Entity manager factory could be a teacher entity manager factory. And then we have the transaction manager. You can define any name, right? You can say it a teacher entity manager factory or a teacher transaction manager, right? So I have defined it entity manager and transaction manager, that doesn't matter, right? So we have injected the data source here as well, and then we have the entity manager factory to point out to. So we have this @qualifier here. So this is how you will define your configurations, right? So these configurations, once defined, when you run your server, now Spring knows that you have the configuration already defined in your classes. So it will go and run those configurations according to your requests, right? So if you are working on a student database, then the transaction manager used would be of this, right? And when you are using the teacher database, then the transaction manager will be of teacher database, right? So this is how you define your configurations. And then let me take you to the controller class, right? Let me take you to the controller class. So here, as I am saying that we'll be working on two different databases in a particular application. So we need different calls, right? First, we need to save some data, right? So I'm saving some data for student, right? So I'm getting a student DTO and I'm using an object builder. That is this method in object builder class. Let me take you to the object builder class first. So it is just we are using the DTO to convert it into a student entity, right? And same is the case for teacher as well. We are using teacher DTO to convert it into a teacher entity. So let me again take you to the controller. So here I am saving some data, right, to the student table. Then I am saving some data to the teacher table, and then I am getting all the data of student and all the data of teacher, right? So you can play around with this APIs as well. You can actually save data into two different databases, and you can use the third database to combine those data and show it to the user. So that could be another application of using three databases in your application, right? So this is my code, and if I take you to the pom.xml as well, let me show you the pom.xml. So it contains two dependency, one for Postgres and one for MySQL, right? So you can see here that one is for MySQL, one is for Postgres. So we have two dependencies as well, right? And now the code part is done. So now let's run the application. But before that, let me define the databases in our particular databases, right? So let me define it in a Postgres database, right? So what is the name that I am giving for the database? Let me check in the application.properties. So I am giving for Postgres as a student database, right? So let me define a student database here. So let me make a teacher schema here. So my teacher schema has been made. Let me set it as a default, right? So now I'm ready with the application, right? So let us go and let us run the application. Let me go in the main class, right? So this is my main class. So let me run the application from here, right? So the server has started, right? So my server is up now, and the name is, let's say, Deepak, right? So let me save this data. So okay, my entry is done. So let me save another data, maybe a student of 12th, right? And the school is, I guess it could be Ritika, right? So let me save this data as well. So the entry is done. So now let me say that I want to save data of a teacher, a simple example, right? So I have an entry in my teacher table as well. So I'll say, right, let me save this data. So now I have two entries in teacher and two entries in student table. So let me go and see the get call for it. So it's get all students, right? So let me say it as get all students, and I have to do it a post call, get call, and I don't need any data, right? So I don't need any data. So let's see the data has been returned or not. So we have the data. So first entry is of Deepak, 11th DPS, second is of Ritika, 12th Modern Public School. So let's say we need teacher data, so it's get all teachers, right? So let me copy this and let me paste it here. So let me run this. So we have first entry for Deepthi Science and Gurjeet Maths. So this is how you can work on two different databases in a particular application, right? So it's not a problem that you are using two databases in an application. Just that your application, the use of your application should be defined, right? Why are you using 2 or 3 different databases in your applications, right? So this was it from this video. Hope that you people like, share, comment on the video, and it takes a lot of efforts to simplify the topics and present it to you. And if you are new to the channel, please subscribe the channel and press the bell icon. Hope to see you in the next video. Till then, happy learning.